Western Civilization, how much do you know? My name is Russell Miles and this is the 37th episode of our Western Civilization series. In the previous episode we examined the emergence of nuclear weapons and looked at the various and complex alliances between Western countries. In this episode we will look at the development of nuclear weapon systems and policy and practice for their use by Western countries. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the only country with an effective nuclear weapon. The US quickly ended its wartime collaboration with the UK, along with Canada, the latter having the only accessible reserve of uranium ore at the time. The UK set about developing its own nuclear weapons, believing they were necessary to deter aggression. The Soviet Union had initiated a nuclear weapons program during the Second World War, but assessed they lacked the resources and know-how to create such for that war. After the war they accelerated their program, leveraging espionage of the US program along with seizing technology from Nazi Germany's rudimentary program. The Soviet Union conducted its first test of an atomic bomb in 1949. The British exploded their first atomic bomb in Australia in 1952. Both the British and the Soviet Union remained behind the US in both nuclear devices and delivery technology. By the 1950s, the US had tested dozens of bombs, refined designs, and built about 50 bombs. In 1952, the US tested a thermo-nuclear weapon or hydrogen bomb with a much larger blast yield of 10 megatons or 50 times that of the Hiroshima bomb. This was essentially increasing the ratio of material fission atom splitting to release energy. In simple terms, the Fat Man atomic bomb had about 17% of material fission before being blasted apart. A hydrogen bomb can reach 85%, but typically 50% of material fission. This approach allowed the US to reduce the size and weight of its bombs while increasing their explosive yield. The coupling of hydrogen bombs to rockets was a critical step in nuclear weapons development. The smaller atomic bomb in rudimentary ballistic missiles was not effectively accurate to damage a specific target, a port, airbase or communication centre. Whereas with a hydrogen bomb of greater explosive power, a ballistic missile did not have to be as accurate to be certain of destroying a target. The UK and Soviet Union soon tested H-bombs, but by which time the US had deployed missiles to Italy and Turkey with the range to hit Soviet cities. The UK was aware that they would struggle to catch up in a nuclear arms race. The British were developing a missile to be launched from bombers that could deliver a nuclear device to an enemy country. At the time, the US was developing nuclear-powered submarines as an invulnerable missile base. So the US offered to share its technological know-how for nuclear devices and missiles in exchange that the British end their weapons development effort. This served US policy to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons not only by foes but allies as well. Thus the US imposed limits on the number of nuclear devices and missiles it would allow the UK to build with US proprietary technology. The British were to maintain jet bombers with the capacity to carry its own designed airdrop bombs as well. The US was also to provide the British with designs for short-range or battlefield nuclear weapons to be used by strike aircraft, rockets and artillery, mostly deployed in the then Western Germany. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained 3 million troops with 30,000 tanks and 7,500 aircraft in Central Europe. The British deployed an army corps of about 60,000 troops in northern Germany. The British were aware of the disparity in their respective forces, but their intention was to cause a massive cost to any invasion in a delaying action. To this end, they developed nuclear landmines which they would plant in locations they believed the Soviets would advance. The problem was northern Germany could be very cold and this depleted the batteries that powered the mines. The solution was to bury a coop of chickens with sufficient air, food and water so their bodies would keep the device warm for the few days the mine needed to lay in wait. This was to be one of many strange applications of nuclear devices. During the Second World War, the United States developed an effective proximity fuse. This is an explosive device that is triggered when it is close to a target. The British Telecommunication and Research Establishment had explored using Doppler radar, bouncing a microwave signal off a target and analysing the altered frequency of the return signal. It activates as the frequency begins to increase as the device recedes from the target, i.e. the closest point. At the time, electronic devices used large vacuum valves which were too fragile to use in shells or rockets. The American Western Electric Company and Radio Corporation of America had developed miniature vacuum tubes intended for use in hearing aids. With further development, these miniature valves could be used in small radars capable of withstanding an acceleration of up to 20,000 G, as experienced by 5-inch anti-aircraft shells. The proximity fuse proved devastating against Japanese naval aviation and German V-1 rockets. Artillery shells were also set to explode above ground, negating entrenching. The program cost $1 billion, building over 22 million fuses and making it the second most expensive scientific project of the war. The atomic bomb was the third most expensive and the B-29 bomber the most expensive. The delivery of an atomic bomb required a proximity fuse and a large B-29 bomber, so the combination of these massively expensive systems created the new weapons of mass destruction. The early Cold War saw increasing innovation of electronic components by the US and Allies. However, an effective guided anti-aircraft missile still required the advent of electronic transistors. An alternative was unguided rockets armed with nuclear warheads, so that a near miss activated by a proximity fuse might damage or destroy an enemy bomber. As mentioned in the previous episode, the Avron Arrow was to carry 2 Genie unguided rockets with 1.5 kiloton W-25 nuclear warhead, which had a range of about 10 kilometres. The USAF and Royal Canadian Air Force were to deploy this weapon on other aircraft until 1985. These devices would have been detonated over these countries' own territory in a desperate attempt to stop enemy bombers. The AIR-2 Genie rocket with nuclear warhead was only tested once in Operation Plumbob on the 19th July 1957. The rocket was fired from a F-89J jet fighter flying at around 20,000 feet. A group of 5 USAF officers volunteered to stand uncovered in their light summer uniforms underneath the blast to prove that the weapon was safe for use over a populated area. The gamma and neutron dose received by the observers on the ground was negligible, while the dose received by the aircrew was the highest for any aircrew during nuclear tests. In the advent of a war, there would have been many such nuclear rockets fired and in various conditions. Presumably any radiation exposure of civilians was balanced against an enemy bomber destroying a city. The nature of war plans if the Cold War had gone hot remains a very closely guarded secret. There is probably more information in the public domain about the Soviet Union's war plans, which were released in the post-Cold War era. The Soviet Union had stated it would not introduce nuclear weapons into any conflict, but their weapons of mass destruction were for deterrence and retaliation. However, Soviet military doctrine entailed integration of all weapons, and they made no distinction between nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. The Soviet military would certainly have utilised tactical nuclear weapons to destroy any enemy nuclear, chemical and biological weapons. The US refused to rule out a first strike. This was in their belief that the Soviets might invade Europe with their very large army if they felt they could avoid a nuclear response. Gerald Watts was a newly graduated medical doctor in the early 1960s. At the time, every fit young man in most Western countries was required to undertake compulsory military service. Gerald Watts was inducted into the United States Air Force. He recounts in his biography of his experiences as a flight surgeon at an airbase where large transport aircraft supported various US Cold War deployments. This engaging tale sees Gerald Watts in Africa for United Nations peacekeeping, flying to Germany, France, Sweden and Portugal, along with medical and psychological care of pilots. It is towards the end of the book that there is a fascinating account involving long-range CF-101 Vandu fighters equipped with Genie nuclear-armed rockets. These fighters shared the base and were tasked to defend the US coast from supposed enemy bombers. The commander of the fighters advised that a young airman whose job was to load the rockets had become distressed. The airman had come to believe that he could make the rocket's nuclear warhead detonate. The fighter commander had advised that he could not disclose the secrets about the rockets, but assured Gerald Watts that no one person could activate these weapons. Gerald Watts conducted an elementary mental status exam. The young airman was above average intelligence, reserved but had several friends, no family history of mental illness, no alcohol or other drug issues, no family conflict, plans for post-service career and no obvious problems. The airman says he felt no unease around other weapons which had no nuclear warheads. As the airbase had no psychiatrist, Gerald Watts referred the airman to a nearby naval hospital for a detailed examination. After 2 weeks, the neuropsychiatric examination reported no health conditions. Gerald Watts felt it best that the airman be assigned to other duties. He continued to see him, there were no further concerns, and the airman returned home at the end of his enlistment. What I found perplexing is that years later, Gerald Watts, who had become an accomplished paediatric surgeon, wrote in his biography, "This airman was asking for help, though I couldn't determine the reason." I discussed this case with a psychiatrist I know, suggesting that the reason ought to have been obvious. The young airman would have been aware that if ever the weapons he was loading were used, then everything would be in ruins and everyone he knew would be dead or dying. Perhaps he was more sensitive and could imagine what would happen. He was the youngest on the specialist loading team, and the others were older and more experienced and probably had developed mutual coping mechanisms. For most people, these weapons are abstract and their purpose is beyond comprehension. I was more surprised that Gerald Watts had not encountered other service personnel who experienced undue anxiety around nuclear weapons. But on Gerald Watts' experience, neither he or anyone else had undue emotional reactions. This seems typical of most people. I've spoken to experienced and senior defence personnel who dismissed nuclear weapons as political and not relevant to military issues, whereas nuclear weapons lie at the very heart of Western defence and security, which we will cover in the next and final episode of this series. If you like this channel, please subscribe and tick like. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I can be contacted at email russmills@iprimers.com.au. Thanks for listening.